Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be taking a look at the modern variation, and this is kind of my ongoing exploration of how to play against the Pirc, because there is a lot of crossover in the Pirc and the modern, and if you like content like this and want to see more of it, please hit that subscribe button. So e4, g6 starts the modern. Now a lot of people think that the only difference between the modern and the Pirc is whether you start with d6 or whether you start with g6. And this is not the case. Not the case in terms of how you're actually going to study it. It might be the case from, a purely philosophical perspective. But the truth is, when you're going to study this, the modern has a lot more to do with what this knight on g8 does than what these pawns do. You can move these pawns basically in any order, and it's still going to be the modern. So we're going to have g6, d4, we're going to have bishop g7, knight c3, we're going to have d6, then we're going to have f4. This begins our Austrian attack. And at this point, generally speaking, you're playing against a modern if they've played g6 and d6 in any order, and they refrain from playing the move knight f6. Now, once they play the move knight f6, we're back into a Pirc, and you're going to study that under the Pirc. So when you're looking up games, when you're looking up lines, when you're memorizing variations, when you look this theory up, you're going to need to look all that theory up under the Pirc once they play the move knight f6. If they refrain from playing knight f6, all of your theory is going to fall under the category of the modern. So at this point, we're not playing an Austrian attack. If they refrain from knight f6, we're playing a pseudo-Austrian attack. And that's what it's called when you're playing the Austrian attack against the modern. And there's a bunch of different things that Black can do if he's decided that he wants to refrain from playing knight f6 to play a more independent modern line. So the two main ones that I see are okay, so there's basically three things Black can do. The first two are just not all that good, even though they look incredibly scary. And the third one is what I would consider kind of the modern main line. And the modern main line has a lot of twists and turns to it. But let's take a look at these first two lines that just aren't terribly frightening. And the first two lines are where Black decides to take some sort of aggressive, immediate plan in the middle of the board with early attacks on White's center. These aren't terribly terrifying, but it seems to make a lot of logical sense to some people because they're trying to utilize the fact that this bishop's diagonal is still open, because again, they have refrained from playing the move knight f6, and they want to try to use this. So one move that they can try is knight c6, and what they're hoping for is knight f3, where they're going to play bishop g4, and then Black's position isn't terrible. It's not great, it's equal. It's approximately a level position at that point. But Black is equalized kind of easily for no real good reason. And White can maintain not just an advantage, but potentially a huge advantage just with the move bishop e3, just not allowing that bishop to g4 pin. And then the whole point here is if they continue with whatever their plan was, if they just continue with the move pawn to e5, this position is actually major advantage White. Now, to a lot of people, this makes total logical sense because they're utilizing this bishop, but keep in mind that Black spent extra time fianchettoing this bishop, and Black started down a tempo in the opening because he moved second. So there's really no justification for opening the position under these kind of conditions. So White should just open the position, exchange, and then White should exchange queens. Now, if king captures, this position is kind of laughable. We would castle queenside with an extra tempo, we would play knight f3, and we would play something like h3. And this is simply major advantage White because Black can never develop his rooks or get his king out of the middle of the board. So this is simply major advantage White. Now, the more logical way that people are going to play this is they're going to take back with the knight, but this just loses by force. We're going to play knight b5, immediately attacking c7. King d7 obviously doesn't work because castle's queenside check. So the only other move is to just mechanically defend that square with knight to e6, but this just loses material to the move pawn to f5. The point is we're going to be winning a pawn here. We're hitting that e6 knight, and the only thing they can do is counterattack our knight on b5, but we take everything with check. So if they, for example, take, and then we take back, and they were to play something like a6, we would actually take the knight, and then we would take here with check, and follow that by taking here with check. And now we're simply up an entire pawn. But more importantly, we have a much better position than Black. Black's king is terribly weak. There was actually a game that was played between Potapov and Tamirov, which ended fairly quickly back in 2012. And that game just went bishop e6, takes. And White just didn't do anything special. He just developed and shuffled his rook to the open file. And then, Black said he had enough. So these aren't terribly difficult positions even for White to convert once he's got this extra pawn and once he's got this extra development. So in general, these early central thrusts with the move pawn to e5 should not be feared. Black doesn't have enough development to justify this type of thing. So the other way that black can play this is black can play an early c6 to put pressure on the middle, typically with either queen b6 or queen a5. Now out of these two, usually they'll throw in bishop g4 first, bishop e3. Out of these two, the move queen a5 is the least threatening of all of these because it's not clear what the queen on a5 is even doing. There is no pressure on e4. There's actually a better version of this that kind of comes out of the Pirc, where black has played an early knight f6 and put some pressure on the square e4, and this actually makes a lot more sense. In this case, it makes very little sense because there is no pressure on this square pawn to e4. So like after, say, h3 takes, knight d7, what is black doing exactly? White pretty much has a free hand. He can do whatever he wants. So he can gain space. This knight isn't doing anything, so this pin isn't doing anything. So then we have something like e6. Castle's queenside should simply be considered somewhere between major advantage to decisive advantage white. White has two bishops, white has more space. And again, what is this queen on a5 doing? It's not clear. So the move that makes a lot more sense is to put direct pressure with the move queen b6. And in this case, the only real thing you have to remember is that if you do have to recapture with gf3, the bishop pair is just more important than the assembled pawns, and the fact that that pawn on f3 is now defending the e4 square can't be viewed as a weakness for you. So you can just simply play queen d2 and say, hey, look, if you really want to spend 2 tempo to give up your bishop pair and strengthen my center, go ahead. I'm not going to stop you. And after bishop f3, gf3, this is a really strong center for white. And it's not like black is going to be playing queen b2. We can simply play rook b1, and we can even get this pawn back on the b7 square. We're not losing any material here. So after knight d7, we can simply castle queenside. And this was actually a game that was played between Shirov and Spielman in France in 1998. That game continued queen c7, h4. And you can see Shirov is getting ready to push all of these pawns on the king side, and it's a very dicey situation. Black doesn't necessarily want to play something like h5. He could run into bishop h3 followed by f5 or something similar. So he just tried to play a move. He played knight on g to f6, but of course that runs into e5. So white ended up getting a very nice position here. He actually pushed this bishop all the way back. Notice again this classic kind of pawn wedge, cutting the board in half, and black's terrible pieces. And then Shirov just got really aggressive with it. He pushed the pawn again, and just totally destroyed black's whole pawn structure, and then got the rest of his pieces involved in the attack against the black king. He exchanged at this point because he's actually just winning material here, so why not just take the extra stuff? And after the dust settled and everything got exchanged, he's just up 2 clean pawns, and he went on to win this game very, very easily. So these direct approaches at kind of pushing white out of the middle of the board don't work very good. So what we run into now is we run into the main line of the modern. Like if we don't want to play this early knight f6, we're just going to have to play the main line of the modern, which starts with a6. Now in the main line of the modern, we actually kind of have to be very careful about how exactly we develop our pieces. As a good rule, as soon as they start threatening to play c5, you want to meet that with the move bishop to e3. So that's like a really good rule. And then another good rule is once they move their pawn to b5 and they're threatening to play b4, if there is any pressure on the e4 pawn, you want to push it to e5 so that your knight has a place to go. But if there's no pressure on the e4 pawn, you don't need to push it right away. A lot of times you're better off finishing your development, and your knight is kind of free to shuffle back to g3 without any difficulties. So those are basically the development rules. So like let's say knight f3, and let's say they play b5 right away. Here, if they play b4, we're going to play knight e2, g3. There is no pressure on e4. So it's actually just more critical to get this bishop out of the way. So now if they play pawn to b4, we're just going to continue with knight e2, followed by knight g3. No problems, because there's no pressure. Now, as soon as they start planting pressure on this e4 square, knight e2 becomes less desirable. So now we don't want to play knight e2. We'd rather not retreat. So this is where we create a place for our knight to go. And in so doing, we're also creating a place for our bishop to go to the e4 square. And this is something that's just a very common theme. We would actually like to exchange our light-squared bishop for their light-squared bishop. Now, This is something that's kind of weird about the Pirc and about the modern, is you really have to kind of rethink your definitions of what is a good bishop and what is a bad bishop. Because we're always traditionally taught what's a good bishop, what's a bad bishop. We're told, okay, a good bishop is a bishop that's on the opposite colored square to his own pawns, and a bad bishop is a bishop that's on the same color square as his own pawns. But of course, in positions like the Austrian attack, a lot of times this can be reversed. And the reason it's reversed is because one side has significantly more space than the other, and one side is actually cutting off his opponent's bishop by doing what we call making it bite on granite. So when you're making your opponent's bishop bite on granite, you're artificially kind of creating this bishop on g7. You're making it bad with your pawns. And this is something that's very possible in chess, especially when you have more space. You're creating a bad bishop, and as a consequence, even though this bishop on b7 has a lot of its own pawns on light squares, there's no center pawns on light squares. So it's got free reign from one side of the board to the other, and that essentially makes it black's best piece. So white actually is the one that has incentive to trade off this bishop. So here, the other thing that you have to worry about is if they try this move order, say knight d7, we're going to play something like a4 immediately, again, because there's no pressure, and then we can shuffle that knight back, and then we can hold our center together. So this is another critical idea that you have to be familiar with. As soon as that pawn goes to b4, and as soon as we retreat, we can start holding that middle of the board together, we can keep that strong center, and we're good to go. Notice again the theme here, no pressure on e4, and we're good to retreat to e2. And we can actually force that retreat if we want to. So a4 is not a move that you necessarily want to shy away from either. So let's go back to kind of the main-ish line. So let's say b4, and again, like if c5 right here, we would immediately take it. And that's usually the remedy. If they've played c5 and they haven't prefaced it with knight d7, you can take it. You don't want them taking back with the knight. This is really critical. If you take on d5, you want them taking back with the pawn, so you can cut the board in half with e5. This is simply major advantage white, much like in the Austrian attack in the main line of the Pirc, where we cut the board in half. It's a similar idea. And that's why in the main line, when they play bishop b7, what we're going to do is we're just going to play a move like e5 so that we have a place for both our knight and our bishop to go. And now when they follow up with knight to d7, we're going to play whenever they're threatening to play c5, we can always play like an immediate bishop e3. In this case, my personal preference is to play something like queen e2, putting pressure on the e6 square. And then let's say pawn to b4, we would have a place for our knight to go on e4. So what are some other things that black can try here other than knight d7? Black can certainly try the move knight to h6. I would say this is definitely one of the main lines. Like against knight h6, I think the main line is simply castles, and then we're going to castle, and then we're going to play something like bishop e4. Again, trying to exchange off this really good bishop. We're putting our good bishop on the same diagonal as our opponent's good bishop, and we're coming up with a very good place to exchange material. So basically, those are the two main themes of just kind of exchanging this material, but also trying to meet at some point them playing the move pawn to c5. So let's go back and let's just look at them employing a slightly different move order. So let's say after a6 we play knight f3 and they play this immediate knight d7. They're trying to play c5. We want to be able to meet that with captures, and we don't want them taking back with the knight where we can't play e5. So here, naturally, we're going to play this good defensive resource bishop e3, and then they're going to play b5. And now, of course, these positions look slightly different because they forced us to play this early bishop e3, but they're not terribly different. Like, let's say bishop d3, and then we're going to have bishop to b7, and now we're going to have basically the same idea. We're going to play e4, preparing to meet b4 with the move knight to e4. Now, you can also get to this position from the other move order. Like, if they play knight to d7, instead of playing the move queen to e2, you can play the move bishop e3, and you can transpose right back into this line. And you can just have this line as your main line for both lines. You don't even need to play the other line. And now this e4 square is available for both your bishop and for your knight. And now normally what black will do here is black will play the move pawn to e6 to try to prevent this pawn for white from going to the e6 square. And here the move bishop e4 is just considered best, because they have basically two choices. If they play the move pawn to d5, this would generally be considered a really good thing for us, because now this bishop on b7 would officially become a bad bishop. The center pawns are now on the same color square as the bishop. And actually, at that point, both of black's bishops would be terrible, because this bishop would be biting on granite, and this bishop would be even worse because it would be biting on its own pawns. So at this point, black is incentivized to trade off his best piece, and then we're putting direct pressure on this d6 square, which means that really the best thing to do is to just move it, play pawn to d5, and this creates a very bad bishop on g7. So then after we say retreat our knight, you would think this bishop on g7 is better than the bishop on e3, because the bishop on e3 has its pawns on dark squares. This is actually not the case. At some point, this bishop on e3 could redeploy to f2 and h4, and it would control this extremely valuable diagonal, whereas the bishop on g8 is likely going to remain unemployed for the rest of the game. So here, white simply is better. White has better pieces, white has more space, white has the better structure, white has an advantage here. And this proved true in Nakamura versus Hutchinson on chess.com back in 2018, where this game was played. So you can just see how that game continued. It continued like this. Nakamura just continued to make moves to gain space and just make black's pieces generally uncomfortable back here on the third rank. And then after a few more space gaining moves, you can just see that black is just completely suffering. And now all of white's pieces are going to come to life, and he's going to get this incredible attacking position. So after f5, we have g4, we have queen h6, and knight f4. Everything is coming into this position, and you can just actually see, even though black has got a dark squared bishop, he's losing on the dark squares. He's actually just losing the entire game on the dark squares. White is just doing very spectacular here. So king h2, rook g1, he exchanged more stuff, and he exchanges off his so-called good bishop, but his position is, it just deteriorates into relative hopelessness after a few more moves. There's an open h-file that he cannot do anything about, and he's just in deep trouble. And black resigned. He couldn't stop the attack, and he never really got his pieces off of those back three ranks. He never really got a chance to, really develop anything or really get anything into really good shape. So in general, those are the main lines in the modern, and that's, of course, they're very different than the Pirc, because, again, the difference between the Pirc and the modern is black just refrains from playing this early knight f6, and usually instead decides to expand on the queen side, or to strike early in the middle of the board. But in either case, white should end up with some sort of advantage if white can navigate the theory properly. So I hope that you found this video helpful. I hope you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.